One of the things that's challenging for me on a Friday night is that I want to get us so much into Kabbalat Shabbat and the spirit that I was describing to you of relaxation and joy and gratitude, and then I have things I need to talk about that are not relaxing or joyful or inspiring of gratitude. So just a little warning here, I'm shifting gears again, and then when I'm done, we'll go back into Mariv, and perhaps you'll get back some of your Shabbat feeling. So you may have noticed that at CBE, the clergy specialize in different life cycle events. Rabbi Colin's the first person who's likely to respond when there's a birth of a new baby. Rabbi Green is the first to do conversions and weddings. Cantor Breitzer works most intensively with the B'nai Mitzvah students. And in most cases, I'm the first person to respond to illnesses and deaths. We, of course, all do all of them, but this is how we tend to specialize. And people ask me if it's depressing to be the one to take most of the deaths. And sometimes it is. Sometimes it feels heavy and sad and hard. But often, I don't find it that way at all. Often, I find it inspiring. In mourning and at a funeral and in Shiva, we get to be real. We get to be raw. We have to be raw a lot of times. We're with grief, but we're also with love. And we're also often with gratitude. We get to honor fully a human life and to tell that person's story and to celebrate who they were and what they dedicated themselves to, and to value their contributions to the world even as we grieve their absence from it. Confrontations with mortality, as we all know from Yom Kippur, give us that much more perspective on the meaning and purpose of our own lives. And that happens to me all the time in this being present with other people in these moments. This week we read Parshat Chayei Sarah. And the portion is called The Life of Sarah, but the first words in the portion are her death. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, whose yahrzeit was this week, said of this parsha, "Why is a parsha about death called life?" The answer, it seems to me, he said, is that not always but often, death and how we face it is a commentary on life and how we live it. So this was a big week for Jewish life and death questions as we consider them in our larger society. On Thursday, opening arguments began in the Charlottesville trial, in which the white nationalists who organized the Unite the Right rally there in 2017 are facing civil charges of conspiracy to commit racist violence that led to death. The lawyers in the case and the organization behind them, Integrity First for America, have managed to collect a huge cache of evidence against rally organizers, including an extensive paper trail in which they communicated their intent to injure and kill. And as we know, they marched in Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us," expressing the white nationalist conspiracy theory that Jews are secretly plotting the death of the white nation, using black and brown people to replace white people in positions of power as part of our global scheme to run the world. 1 year later, in 2018, 11 Jews were gunned down at a place called Tree of Life in Pittsburgh while praying at Shabbat morning services simply because they were Jewish. The 3-year anniversary of that massacre was this Wednesday. And on that day, a white man, whipped up by Trump's ravings that a caravan of Central American immigrants was approaching the southern border, decided that Chayei, the Jewish Organization for Refugee and Immigrant Resettling, quote, likes to bring in hostile invaders to dwell among us, unquote, concluding that Jews were plotting the death of the white nation. And as we know, that led him on a rampage that killed Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, Irving Younger. May their memories continue to inspire us to blessing. We can see in Charlottesville and in Pittsburgh a process of inversion. In promulgating the idea that Jews are conspiring for the death of something precious, the death of America's greatness, or the death of white supremacy, or the death of life as we know it, the white nationalists justify doing the very thing that they accuse Jews of doing. They actually did conspire. They actually did seek the death of others. They actually did kill. And in this inversion, they justified their actions to themselves as a kind of self-defense or an act of courage against the forces of death. The Charlottesville trial and the work of Integrity First for America is so crucial because it holds these Nazi and white nationalist leaders accountable for their words and their actions, making it prohibitively expensive for them to hold rallies and continue their incitement. This is crucial. But this idea that Jews cause death and therefore must be killed has its most obvious recent antecedent in the Third Reich, but it goes back through all of the blood libels throughout our history, to the beginning of Christianity, and even before that. Many of you know that I was arrested for civil disobedience a week ago, Monday, along with Rabbi Colin and Lisa Cowan, supported by members of our Dayenu circle. We were at BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world, and the largest investor in fossil fuels. They have $80 billion that they are investing in new coal power plants. Can you imagine making that decision right now? And $80 billion more in drilling on indigenous lands, including the Amazon rainforest. This protest was calling on Larry Fink, BlackRock's CEO, to divest before the UN climate conference, which is happening next week in Scotland. And of all of the life and death questions of our time, this one feels like a very, very stark one and very clear between forces of death and forces of life. The fact that the CEO of BlackRock is Jewish is very, very delicate in what's probably going to be an ongoing campaign to get them to change what they're doing. The protest was organized by Jewish youth, and they were calling upon Larry Fink, as a Jew, to do the right thing. So we had to be very, very careful in our language and all the messages about exactly how we did that. We asked him to join us in our shared Jewish values of protecting the earth. I mention this because 2 days later, in an unrelated action, but as part of the environmental movement and organized by youth, the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Sunrise Movement did something strikingly anti-Semitic. Sunrise is a youth-led grassroots organization or movement for the reversal of climate change. And the Sunrise Movement was formed in 2015 by community organizers who decided to focus on electing candidates to office who refused to accept donations from fossil fuel companies. And the Green New Deal is theirs. The movement is decentralized, with chapters around the country. And last week, Sunrise DC, the DC chapter, said that it would pull out of the National Voting Rights rally, which is happening in DC. It may have already happened, that they were going to pull out of this rally unless 3 organizations were ousted from the coalition. And these 3 organizations were the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, that's us, the National Council on Jewish Women, and the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. The reason given was that these 3 organizations are Zionists. All 3 organizations support a 2-state solution, meaning that they feel that they support both Israel and a Palestinian state. And all of them speak out against the occupation of the West Bank. All 3 organizations have a storied history of fighting for voting rights, in particular in this country. The Voting Rights Act was actually signed in the offices, or written in the offices of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. And many other non-Jewish organizations of the coalition also support both Israel and Palestine. Singling out the Jewish organizations from the coalition was a glaring case of anti-Semitism in the guise of anti-Zionism. Now, after a wave of outrage that came in response to this, Sunrise DC eventually changed their position and argued that all of the organizations that support the continued existence of the State of Israel, even if they also support a Palestinian state, should be ousted from the coalition. This remains deeply problematic and wrong. And they have now doubled down on that position with a lot of pushback. Let's ask ourselves if there is any other ideology over which progressive organizations are removed from a progressive coalition. Can you think of any? Consider the Catholic Church, which stands in opposition to reproductive rights, abortion rights and other forms of reproductive rights, and LGBT rights, but is an active coalition partner on immigrant rights and economic justice issues. And no one talks about removing them from those coalitions. It's not even a question. This is how coalitions work. We need them because all popular strength is in numbers, so we put aside disagreements about really important matters, very heated matters, in order to fight together for those things in which we share common purpose. What happened with Sunrise DC last week was not isolated. We are seeing the beginning of what I think is going to be a purge, one that has already explicitly been called for by some on the left, a purge of Zionist organizations and a purge of Zionists, people, from progressive coalitions. The way that we respond to this will be of utmost importance. These purge attempts are only really possible, I think, because of a successful campaign over some length of time to not only delegitimize Zionism, but to falsely claim that Zionism is genocide, and that Israel and Jews are genocidal. And that is only possible because of the ready association of Jews with death, as purveyors of death, out of more than 2,000 years of antecedents. It's only possible because the world is so practiced and accustomed to this inversion that we saw play out so tragically in Pittsburgh 3 years ago. Now, I want to be clear that this is not a defense in any form of the Israeli government's policies or of the occupation of the West Bank. It is not a denial of the actual deaths that have happened in Israel and in Palestine and in the region over the last century. Anyone who's been listening to me knows that I do not hesitate to excoriate the Israeli government for its abuse of Palestinian lives and the denial of Palestinian futures. But certainly, Israel is not the only one to blame for the terrible loss of life that the conflict has wrought. And though I've spent as much time tonight on this nonviolent recent incident on the left as on the deadly conspiracy of anti-Semitism on the right, it isn't because I think what's happening on the left is as dangerous as what's happening on the right. It is not. But we, most of us, are a lot closer to it. Our own organizations are in these coalitions, and therefore we have a different need to take a stand. It's also much harder to take a stand because these are our friends, because we share a common purpose. It takes much more courage to take a stand when it happens on the left. But we must. We all have social media platforms, or maybe many of us, maybe we don't. Some of us have social media platforms. We all have some circle of influence in our lives. Now is the time to stand unequivocally against these purges, no matter how you feel about Israel. Even if you're an anti-Zionist, purges of Zionists are bad for Jews, and they're bad for progressive movements, for social change. Think about how the Lavender Menace purge of lesbians in the second wave feminism, or the Red Scare, looks from the perspective of history. Not good. Overall, we must better understand anti-Semitism in order to function effectively in movements for social change. Beginning in January, I am going to be offering a class on Shabbat after the morning service, on Saturdays after the morning service, in which we read together a number of books, starting with Anti-Judaism by David Nierenberg. It's a really important book that's about the history of the idea of anti-Judaism, and continuing with Dara Horn's most recent book, People Love Dead Jews. That's the title of the book. It came out this year. And I'll share more information about this class soon. We have work to do to understand this, and we have work to do to gain the courage to speak out, as we must. Now, it makes sense that the parsha that we read this week, that begins with Sarah's death, is called Sarah's life. Not only because mourning any death gives us an opportunity to celebrate life, but because her life in particular was defined by an overarching purpose, something that transcended her years on earth. Her life was about creating a future for a new people who would become the Jews. And the rest of the parsha after she dies is about securing that future, as her descendants we are practiced in wresting life out of death. And it is upon us, all of us, to continue what she began by standing for life. Everyone else's lives, yes, but ours too. Shabbat shalom.